presentation. And thank you so much, Marlene, for this introduction. As you were mentioning, in this 10 minutes, I will provide you an overview of all the different kind of disaster risk terminology that we have seen it in literature. So, real case disasters actually showed us the complexity of the interaction between different risk factors. For example, we might remember in California in 2021, enormous wildfire that were driven by extreme heat, dryness, wind, and ample fuel. As well, we could remember, for example, in 2020, the Somali triple threat of floods, locusts, and COVID-19. And in Australia, the concurrent disaster of drought and bushfires. But actually, to have disasters, it doesn't mean that risk factors need to occur in the same space and at the same time. But we have seen that actually disasters occur also when risk factors interact in the same space, but in different time. So we might remember, for example, on the left, in Haiti, communities was hit by earthquake and then also by the tropical storms. In 2017 and then in 2018, first in Peru and then in the Horn of Africa, we had communities that were first hit by long droughts and then by floods. And also we have seen that actually risk factors are able to interact between each other also if they are completely in different area and still able to lead to enormous impacts. So, for example, the heat waves and the drought in 1983 that occur in the USA as well as in the western side of eastern side of Brazil and South Africa that led to the synchronous crop failure. So we have seen that actually there are common characteristics in all these different examples that I showed. There are multiple physical and societal drivers that they interact between each other. There is the interaction between risk components, so exposure, vulnerability, and hazard. And as well, we have seen that this interaction tend to vary over space and time. So when we try then to take into consideration all the complexity of this interaction and the dimension of space and time, we are wondering how we actually, as a scientist, are currently disentangle the complexity of disaster risk. And looking at the literature, there are so many terminology that we have used so far. We have multi, systemic, compound, connected, concurrent, cascading. And it's a very challenge to try to understand conceptually what all of these terms mean. So for example, the paper of Simon et al. In 2021, he tried to map all of these terms in this map on the left. But still, he also mentioned that actually there is no clear boundary between all the different terminology. And today we are trying a bit to understand what are the different characteristics of each terms. So if we remember about go to the multi, this, for example, we have heard a lot about multi-risk or multi-hazard risk. So when we talk about multi-risk, we are usually referred to multiple hazards that interact between each other in the same place. This also means that we are taking into consideration interaction that occurs simultaneously or cascading over time, but also we take into consideration the dynamic nature of the vulnerability as well. So as a subsector, we have the concurrent. So we have hazard that occur in the same space and the same time, as well we have cascading. So hazard that occur one after the other in the same space, but in different time. It can be that they are correlated between each other or they're completely independent. So in this case, we have an earthquake and then we have a storm. Then we go to the terminology of compound. It's actually a terminology that was used mainly in the last period. And if you look at how IPCC define it, then compounding risk are defined as the interaction between two or more extremes that could occur successively or simultaneously. So for example, we can have two events that are just occurring one after the other with high correlation, drought, and then we have bushfires. As well, we can have two events that doesn't have a correlation, so windstorm, and then we have a flood. Or we could have two events that are occurring at the same time and space, and they can have low correlation or high correlation. We also, IPCC defined compounding risk as, for example, extremes that combine with background condition that could amplify their impact. So we can think about structural poverty, conflict, or food insecurity, or we could also think about extremes that actually result from a combination of non-extreme events. And then we go to the definition of connected. And connected try a bit to add an additional element to the compoundness to the previous one. And this element is the human system. It actually is represented through the response. So if you think about the cultural heritage, the history, this is affecting both the exposure and vulnerability, but also the response of the human system to a certain kind of impacts, which then have feedback loop to the impacts, hazard, and the combination of drivers. Another terms that we have seen it is systemic. So actually this terms is quite new and try to embed the nature of risk in larger context of the societal processes. It was mainly used for the financial sector. So for example, if you remember the global financial crisis in 2018, that's was called a systemic risk. But currently it's also been used a lot also for climate risk. So we might, usually what they represent is a risk that actually led to complete breakdown of the system. So for example, completely breaks of health, transport, and environment, all the different systems to which the society depends upon. An example, for example, is the Hurricane Sandy that affected USA, Jamaica, and Cuba, and the Dominica, and actually led to 60 billion of damage, 233 casualties, as well as impact on energy, transportation, and financial system. So now we have seen all the different terms, and actually we have seen on what they are actually focused. But now let's try to take a real case example. So before I was mentioning the example of the Horn of Africa, that communities were hit first by a long drought and then by a flood. But actually, if we focus on Ethiopia, we have seen that during that period, also the country was affected by full army war, by conflict, there was political power change, the heavy rain led also to landslide and floods. So how actually then we are gonna disentangle the complexity of this risk? So if we now look at compoundness, then that means that we are gonna take into consideration of how the northwestern region were affected by the drought that then led to food insecurity, the poor harvest, and how this affected south and southeastern region, which also were hit by a drought and then by flood and have a precondition of poverty, structural poverty. Then when we consider connected, then we consider drought and then the response of the people to try to deal with this disaster and how this affect their exposure and vulnerability to another hazard, like for example, a flood. When we think about multi-hazard, then we take into consideration south and southeastern region, so the same place, and how all these hazards, they occur together. And then we have subsector cascading. That means that they occur in the same place, but then occur first the heavy rain, then there was the flood, and then there was the landslide, all concurrent. So they're occurring at the same time in the same space. So for example, in this case, drought and conflict in some area, or in some other drought and crop pest. And finally, so why is that important to consider all this interaction in the early warning system? So if you remember, in March 2021, there was a severe tornadoes was forecasted in the Mississippi Valley. That means that this area was hit first at a windstorm, but also flash flood. Of course, was in the recent period, so we also have to consider the COVID-19. And one of the warning messages that was issued by the National Weather Service was that were suggesting people to shelter in the lowest floor, as well as move to the closest shelter. But of course, if you think about to the flash flood, the lowest floor was not the best advice, as well as for the COVID-19, aggregating together in the same shelter without keeping the distance, then was also not the best advice if we want to consider all of this interaction. And this is why it is then important to consider all the complexity of disaster risk. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. And if you have any question, I will be happy to answer. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Alessia. Adele, are we taking questions now, or do you want people to just post them on the Miro board and we'll circle back later?
I think that's what we would like to do, the latter. We would like people to put their questions either in the chat here or on the Miro board, and then at the end of all the presentations, we'll come back and answer all the questions. So once again, if you haven't seen the Miro board yet, please go ahead and check it out.
Great, thanks. Well then, thanks, Alessia, for that.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's one more thing. There's also a section that we have for questions, general questions or comments. So if there's anything people want to just put down there, I've been trying to add some notes. So please feel free to do that as well.
Good, great, thanks. Then Erica, you can share your screen and I'll introduce you. So please, warm welcome to Erica Melendez. She's a PhD candidate with the Center of Applied Research in Hydrometeorology at the Polytechnical University in Catalonia. She has a background in flood risk management and civil engineering, and her research interests are disaster risk reduction, early warning systems, impact-based warnings, and risk communication during emergency, especially for hydrometeorological hazards. And so in this context, she's currently working on designing and implementing a community-based early warning systems for locations at risk by blending radar-based nowcasting, numerical weather prediction models, and local impact knowledge. Thanks, Erica. The floor is all yours.
Hi, everyone. My name is Erica, like it was said before, and today I will be talking a bit about the research that I'm doing within my department and a bit of what we're doing related to multi-hazard and early warning system. So the title of this short presentation is People-Centered Impact-Based Early Warning Systems in Times of Climate Emergency. Oh, wait, I think I can. Oh, can you see the next slide? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So this in the left, you can see a picture of a city here in Catalonia, where you can see cars trapped in water. And this is usually something that happens frequently every year. And in the bottom, you can see a picture of an event in France. And within our department, we have noticed that there's a lot of advanced early warning system and impact-based forecasting, a lot of algorithms, but sadly, there's still a lot of citizens and local authorities that expose themselves in extreme rainfall or weather situations because they cannot necessarily understand the local risk of the weather that is upcoming. And it's a pretty common situation. So we have thought that it's not only important to know when an event is going to happen, because we can see that we are advancing pretty well in that area. Also, it's not only important to know where it's going to happen, but what are the consequences, what are the impacts, and most importantly, what are the actions or self-protection actions citizens and local authorities can perform to mitigate the risk based on their vulnerabilities, right? So within our department, we have worked with the Anywhere project to move towards multi-hazard impact-based forecast and warnings. And basically the idea is to make a shift in the way of dealing with these emergencies, emphasizing on what the weather might cause. So like these consequences that I'm telling you in time and space, and rather what it might be. So not only focusing on the meteorological parameters, but on the impacts that can happen. In this aspect, we have worked with different countries in the European Union. And in this slide, you can see an example of a platform that we have for Spain that's called A4SNM. And it's a multi-hazard platform that has all the different hazards that can affect the country, the different warnings, and how they interact between each other. So we have been able to provide national and regional emergency management support. This platform right now is officially used by the government. And in the next steps is that we're trying to move towards the small communities, right? because a large amount of the interventions during the year are executed by local civil protection. So at the moment, we're trying to move towards the communities, because even though we are supporting now the national government, some of these small events might get missed when we have such a big picture, right? And we have seen that in Spain, at least, some of the extreme events happen in the small cities that not necessarily are the priority of the national government, so to speak. And we know that there is a need for a community-based tool and information to support the local authorities during emergencies, so that they have a system and tools that not necessarily focus on what is the big picture, but what is happening to them based on the hazards that they're exposed to, their vulnerabilities, and most importantly, their response capabilities, right? Because we can say, oh, you have to evacuate this whole area of a vulnerable section, and that not necessarily is that easy to do, right? So our next step from the national and regional aspect that we were working on is to move towards people-centered and community-based impact early warning system, which is a bit of what I'm working at the moment, and is a type of early warning system framework that we're proposing, that the design is focused on the communication needs and local vulnerabilities of communities and their citizens. And it's co-designed and co-evaluated with the community stakeholders. So we work together with them to understand what are the hazards, what are the self-protection plans or protocols they already have implemented, what are the problems that they have, to understand what are the elements that can be in danger in case of an emergency, and what is the best way to communicate this in an emergency. So we come from the common analysis and forecast data that can be greater base nowcasting or numerical weather prediction. But we take that information and we put them into their situational context. So we put that into a city, in a community, or a specific vulnerable point. And we take into account their communication requirements in case of an emergency to transform the forecast into actionable decisions. And we not necessarily only look, at the moment, one type of hazard, right? If the city has, for example, in a city in Spain that we're working right now, they have problems with wind. So we have to take that into account, next to intensity, accumulations, and all this type of stuff that cannot be seen individually, because they need actions when the three happen together, right? So the pillars of the system that we're trying to implement is that we have a community level emergency management support. So we want to provide advanced information and preparedness at a local scale. So the small vulnerable communities, which usually have limited resources, can be prepared in case of an emergency. In this case, one of the examples that we have is that the big platform that I showed before, the regional one, we are trying to implement it in different cities across Spain right now, and then there's some in France. Location or specific impacts. So we try to translate the meteorological and hydrological hazards into community-specific impacts. This is done, and it's only feasible if you work together with the community to understand what is an impact for them, right? So instead of just going to the typical yellow, orange, and red warning, we communicate what they already are co-designing with us. And finally, we provide local self-protection actions. So when we work together with the local authorities, we understand the impacts, but what is important is that we also provide actions that are feasible for them to act on in case of a warning, right? So the empowerment of local authorities and citizens to react accordingly to their context and risk. So they can, either we take self-protection plans that are already pre-approved by local authorities, or we could design with them the self-protection plans in specific vulnerable sites or communities. And as an outcome from these implementations that we have at the moment, which has this specific methodologies to pilot sites in Catalonia. We have implemented this for specific vulnerable points within the cities. And it's available for other types. And right now with the COVID situation, a bit of the self-protection plans and the messages had to be modified, because this is an interesting story. One of the schools that we are implementing this type of system, because of the COVID-19 situation, they cannot evacuate all the students to the same place because there's limitations about the capacity or the amount of people that can be in one room. So now we have to work with them and understand, okay, where is another place that we could evacuate, and what is the type of warning that you want to receive because of this COVID-19. And all this experience that I'm explaining right now, that we talk with them, that we work with them, it's because at the end, the idea is to have warning levels based on the impact. So if we have a city, there could be different vulnerable points, but all of them have different warning levels because their vulnerability and their response capabilities are different. We can provide the self-protection actions. They are already aware of the actions because they work with us. And we provide the site-specific warning messages. So it's specific messages that they receive for their location. They could be subscribed to other locations as well. And the local authorities also have this type of mobile app. And this app right now is not, the one that you can see on the screen is not necessarily for public use because we're testing it, and it's oriented for local authorities and first responders. And it provides tailor-based communication. It's co-designed with them. It has the specific levels, all the protection actions. We're also implementing this app with the responsibles of specific sites. For example, the school, the principal, and some of the teachers have it, so they can see the messages. Provides rainfall forecast up to 24 hours, push notifications, and is connected with the community or the city platform that I showed before, because we want to create a whole system where the local authorities and specific people are empowered to react in case of an emergency. And it's currently in operation, and we are planning on implementing other types of hazards, because at the moment we have intensity and warnings for intensity for river warnings and urban floods. But while working with the communities, we understand that there's other types of hazards that need to be included, such as wind. Right now, COVID, the local authorities want specific messages in case there's a breakout through or any type of situation or actions that need to be changed. So this dynamic evolution of the vulnerability has to be taken into account. And we have proposed with the communities that now after every season, we have to refresh the system so it's up to date with what is happening.
One more minute, Eric.
Yeah. Yes.
Just 1 more minute. You have 1 minute.
Yeah. This is the last slide. So to support the community and their citizens to face the climate emergency, we are planning on moving forward and implement this in other municipalities. And we are trying to work with other communities that are outside of Spain, so we can help increase the resilience of the European and the worldwide society. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please put it on the Miro board.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think I'll take it here. Thanks, Erica, for that discussion, that presentation. That was nice to see that different hazards are at least being considered. And I know you spoke about the importance of having this community-based approach and really including impacts. So our next presenter, which is Matthias, I think he's going to go on a similar topic, but maybe discuss more about how you could actually collect some of those impacts and how you can develop the actual development of the impact warnings. So Matthias, he is currently working with the Meteorology and Society Department of the National Meteorological Service of Argentina. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Buenos Aires and a master's degree from the University of Mexico in social anthropology. His previous work has focused on the study of tornado prevention and policies. And currently he is his work is linked to the analysis of damages and impacts caused by meteorological events, and the generation and registration of systematic tools and training. So a bit of a mouthful. But Matthias, thank you, and I believe the floor is yours.
Thanks, Adele. Hello, first of all, I would like to thank the RiskKAN network for the invitation. Also, thank you very much for your presence. Today, I'm going to share with you the presentation entitled Integration of Social and Environmental Impact Information in the Provision of Weather Forecast, Reflection from the Experience of the Argentine National Meteorological Service. In this opportunity, I would like to share with you some reflections on how social science can collaborate with atmospherics and climate sciences. This presentation is based on my work as a social anthropologist in the Department of Meteorology, Met and Society of the National Meteorological Service of Argentina. The general approach of our projects is built from the concept to incorporate integrated disaster risk management and the perspective of co-production of knowledge. In particular, we work mainly in articulation with decision makers and risk management sector, such as civil defense, Red Cross, National Park Administration, etc. I'm interested in presenting the work we are currently doing to incorporate damage and impact information in the provision of meteorological information. What concerns us is not longer exclusively the meteorological phenomenon itself, but also what impacts are generated by meteorological phenomena in particular contexts. This perspective is synthesized in impact-based forecasting. It's already established in some countries, especially in Europe and the USA. However, in Latin America, it is still a new and incipient paradigm. Incorporating impact-based forecasting forces us to develop works process adjust to the national context in line with the global standard. We frequently see the repercussions of the effects of meteorological events in different sources, formats, and platforms. We can access the information through newspaper, television, social network, WhatsApp messages, reports from official agencies, camera monitoring systems, etc. The relative simplicity that we have to generate, consult, and process data brings us face to face with volumes of information that were unthinkable in the last century. The challenge is not so much to generate the information, the challenge is to process the information under adequate methodological criteria. Anyone has the possibility of finding available information. However, not always possible to use it successfully. I believe that we, as social scientists, have advantages and skills to conduct this exercise. For example, we have in our favor our ability to analyze problems on an integral approach. However, we still have a lot to learn in the manipulation and processing of information that was not generated firsthand by ourselves, but comes from secondary sources. Considering the complexity of the task, an interdisciplinary approach is required. A central aspect in the discussion is the challenge of combining qualitative and quantitative information. This presents a major problem since anthropologists are much more accustomed to producing and processing qualitative information, while meteorologists are more accustomed to using quantitative variables in their analysis. The dialogue is enriched by the contribution of users and stakeholders. The way that we found to address this challenge has several edges that are contemplated in our strategic plan. On one hand, the specific process to establish the basis from impact-based forecasting. Secondly, a project aimed at unifying the different databases related to the occurrence of meteorological events. Thirdly, linked to the new early system warning of our institution. Lastly, within the framework of an experimental project in conjunction with the National Weather Institute and the local civil defense of a municipality located in the south of Buenos Aires city. These four projects have a common thread: how to incorporate the recording and systematization of impact information into a forecast production cycle. The core of this work consists in generating a reliable and flexible tool that allows to adequately record a wide variety of information, spatial data, temporal data, type, and characteristics of events, meteorological variables measured with instruments, social environmental damage effects and consequences on livelihoods, metadata, etc. At the same time, it must be a tool capable to incorporate different sources of information to allow searches with specific filters and to involve user information participation. I would like to specifically point out the work we carry out to standardize information on damages and impacts, which is eminently qualitative. For this purpose, we take as a reference the classification proposed by the European Severe Weather Database designed by the European Severe Storm Laboratory. This classification consists of a categorization of possible damage and impacts generated by severe storms, organized in different fields related to transportation, infrastructure, housing, vegetation, agriculture, and among others. It has the advantage of standardizing a wide range of situations under fixed scope. However, we identified the need to revise and adapt the original proposal. Based on the original classification, we carry out a thorough discussion point by point to validate each category. This exercise allowed us to formulate the classification and adapt it to our context, according to our own criteria and in coherence with the original proposal. Now you can see the adaptation we developed. This adapted version is a translation and extension of the original categorization. We are currently using as the reference in the registration tool we are developing together with Civil Defense, Argentine Red Cross, and National Parks Administration. I'm interested in pointing out that this work is part of the horizon of the National Meteorological Service, being able to receive and manipulate impact information provided directly by emergency and risk management agencies. This information would serve different purposes, such as verification of forecasts, adjustments of alert levels, or emission of warnings that contemplate the impacts of an event. In addition, it constitutes valuable information for civil defense agency, as it would allow them to make decisions and establish action plans based on concrete empirical information. Finally, to conclude, I would like to state that the deep social and environmental crisis we are going through raises the concern of making the approach to disaster more complex. Currently, integrating multiple hazards, systemic risks, population exposure, and social and environmental vulnerability is a considerable challenge for our risk management system. Also, the COVID pandemic highlights this. Inattention to COVID should not make invisible the enormous number of other hazards and risks to which we are constantly exposed as a result of environmental degradation. Undoubtedly, these new demands force us further deepen our study and understanding of social and meteorological processes. However, from my point of view, it's naive to have full confidence that more and better early warning systems are the solution. I believe that these advances will never be enough if we do not consider altering the structural causes that bring us closer and closer to collapse. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was an interesting statement you concluded with, and maybe something we could discuss a little bit more in the discussion about really whether, what are the aspects that need to improve, and not only just the technical side, but also on the social side. I will just say the presenters so far, if you haven't already, you can already start to answer some of the questions in the Miro just by adding another sticky note to it, and then we'll go into more detail afterwards. But next, I'll introduce our final presenter. We have Gemma, and Gemma is going to give us a different perspective. I know we've been speaking mostly about some hydrometeorological hazards, but Gemma is going to be presenting on earthquake early warning systems, as well as some of the current research that she's working on. So Gemma is a senior research fellow at UCL. She specializes in developing statistical tools to support decision-making related to seismic activity and other natural hazards. She is currently working to quantify, model, and communicate disaster risks. As the co-lead on the risk working group within the GCRF-funded Tomorrow's Cities Hub. And she's also contributing on work towards the next generation earthquake early warning system within the EU-funded Turnkey project. So yeah, Gemma has a PhD in earthquake engineering, and we would like to invite her to start her presentation. So please, Gemma.
Thanks very much, Tidal, and thanks for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here. So firstly, I'm going to talk about risk-informed decision-making approaches for earthquake early warning. So firstly, why do we need these risk-informed decision-making approaches, and how are they lacking in current earthquake early warning systems? So to answer that question, we first need to think about how an earthquake early warning system works. So firstly, we have some seismic waves that are incoming from an event. They get detected by some seismic stations, and then some algorithms are used to translate the characteristics of those seismic waves into seismological parameters about the earthquake, like its magnitude, for example, or the ground shaking it might cause. And then based on those seismological parameters, we make a decision on whether or not to issue an alert. So a simple decisional rule that might be implemented in earthquake early warning systems today would be, let's issue an alarm if the expected magnitude of the incoming earthquake will exceed 6. But this type of approach has a number of limitations. The first one being that actually, when we think about seismological parameters, they're not quantifying the effects of the incoming earthquake on the built environment. We need earthquake engineering tools to do this. And the second limitation of this type of approach is that it doesn't account for different stakeholder perspectives on risk. So to overcome those two challenges, myself and my colleagues developed a new method for decision-making for earthquake early warning that combines tools from earthquake engineering with multi-criteria decision-making procedures. And by tools for earthquake engineering, I mean ways in which we can translate those seismological parameters of an incoming earthquake into quantifiable effects on the built environment in terms of metrics like the repair cost it might cause or the casualties it might cause. So these are metrics that are interpretable to stakeholders. And one such methodology is the FEMA P58 methodology, if anybody's familiar with it. And then what do I mean by multi-criteria decision-making? So the best way to explain this is using an example. So let's say we're interested in managing earthquake risk for a school. And by earthquake risk in this case, I mean also risks associated with an earthquake early warning system in the sense of unnecessarily triggering an alarm as well, because false alarms also carry some risks. So for this objective, there might be multiple criteria of interest to a stakeholder. And that's why we need a multi-criteria decision-making approach. So they might want to maximize the safety of people. They might want to maximize school productivity, let's say, and they might want to maximize public satisfaction. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to translate those criteria into quantitative indicators. So we can translate maximizing safety into minimizing number of casualties, for instance, and we could think about maximizing school productivity as minimizing the number of disruption days. And then what happens is it's the value associated with each of these types of losses or indicators for a given action. So either trigger the alarm or don't trigger the alarm, and the values associated with both of these actions. And also the importance of the criteria to a stakeholder that will determine whether or not an action is triggered for an incoming event. So we developed this methodology where, first of all, we need to develop a consequence matrix. And this essentially synthesizes each of the criteria of interest to the stakeholder along the columns, and then each possible action that the stakeholder can take is synthesized along the different rows. Then the information for this consequence matrix comes from a number of different sources. The first one being the earthquake early warning infrastructure itself, which gives us the seismological parameters that are the output of a conventional earthquake early warning system. And then we translate those into the consequences or the criteria of interest to the stakeholder using our earthquake engineering tools. And then we also rely on some stakeholder feedback in this case, because if we think about, if I just go back, if we think about the different criteria for the different possible actions, one of the consequences of taking an action might be taking that action unnecessarily. And it will be up to the stakeholder to tell us what type of consequences that kind of action might incur. So we need stakeholder feedback there. And then we also need stakeholder feedback once we translate our consequence matrix into a decision matrix. Because in the decision matrix, we take into consideration the importance of each of the different criteria to the stakeholder. So how much they weight each of the criteria. So this W value is largest for the criterion that's most important to the stakeholder. And then we take finally the optimal action that minimizes the collective values of the criteria across the decision matrix. So let's go into a quick example application of this type of method for a school located in California. So in this case, we're going to consider just two possible actions, either trigger the alarm or don't trigger the alarm. And then the criteria of interest in this case are the similar criteria to what I presented in a previous slide. So our consequence matrix is quite simple in this case. And then we come along and we look at our methodology. And for this case, we're going to assume that the earthquake early warning system is an ideal system that's providing us certain and accurate estimates of the incoming ground shaking associated with the earthquake. And we're then going to run through our methodology for a number of potential values of the ground shaking to determine the optimal action in each case. So once we run through our methodology, we can come up with a plot like this, where we have the incoming ground shaking on the x-axis. We have optimal decisions, so either trigger the alarm or don't trigger the alarm on the y-axis. And we can take a number of observations from this plot. So the first one is that as we increase the value of ground shaking, we tend to go from an optimal action of triggering no alarm, so no action, to the optimal situation of triggering the action. And a second thing to take away from this plot also is the fact that you can see for a given level of ground shaking, actually the optimal action can change depending on stakeholders' preferences towards the different criteria. So if a stakeholder prefers minimizing casualties over other types of criteria, then they might end up actually triggering the alarm at a much lower level of ground shaking than they would if they preferred other types of criteria. So really, this plot underlines the importance of stakeholder feedback when coming up with a decision-making approach for earthquake early warning. So in conclusion, we developed this methodology that combines tools from earthquake engineering and multi-criteria decision-making. And we demonstrated it for a school and found that the optimal action changes as a function of ground shaking, which we might expect, but it also changes as a function of stakeholder preferences towards different types of loss, underlining the importance of a participatory process in earthquake early warning. And another important feature of this approach is actually we can build this plot ahead of time. And all we need to do in real time is determine the ground shaking from our earthquake early warning system and simply consult the plot to determine the optimal action. So we can do really rapid decision-making compatible with earthquake early warning. And there's just some documents on this method. But I just want to briefly comment on some critical perspectives about earthquake early warning. So the first thing to remember about an earthquake early warning system is that it doesn't exist in isolation. There's a suite of risk mitigation approaches that are available to us, both before an event happens and also after an event happens. And earthquake early warning happens to be just one of those approaches. And all of the different tools that we have available to us play a unique role in the mitigation and planning process. An important thing to remember actually is that earthquake early warning may not be the best strategy for mitigating earthquake losses. So we can't think about it as a kind of a cure-all solution. Particularly long-term approaches like retrofitting and replacing buildings, for instance, might be much more effective at reducing losses for earthquakes. And of course, earthquake early warning plays a role, but we need to understand its role within the context of all of the tools available to us. So with that in mind, at the moment, I'm developing a framework for quantifying future risk from natural hazards. And one of the integral parts of the framework is the consideration of multiple different policies that we can implement today to change the risk of the future. And it's not just considering one type of risk mitigation tool, but many different risk mitigation tools that we can use that can work together to better mitigate risk for the future. So thank you very much for listening.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Gemma. Interesting presentation. I'm actually quite interested in this idea of, finding what really is the optimal solution. And I know, it's not just about trying to quantify the risk and the hazard, but yeah, really trying to incorporate the users' perspectives and their requirements is quite important. And also what I like about this is some of these concepts could be also applied to different hazards. So even though you've applied it to earthquakes, it's also applicable to other hazards, and also maybe somehow we can do this with multiple hazards. So maybe now is our time to have questions, to answer some of the questions from the presenters. I can see already we have some questions inside here. I see we have 26 participants, but maybe just about 13 people inside the mirror board. But maybe I can put Alessia on the spot since she was first to present. Someone asked, and I think we all kind of have this question about how do you disentangle the impacts of different hazards? So I see you already answered it, but maybe you can just delve into it a bit more.
Yeah, it's actually something very complex and actually very new. So there are a few recent papers that try to address this problem, but of course it would be nice that as a community, we also kind of brainstorm on how we would do. But one approach is the bottom-up approach, where actually you don't start as a classic risk analysis where you start with the hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and then go to the impacts, because then you would not take into consideration all potential drivers and factors. But the idea is that you start first with the impacts. So then you first analyze what are all the impacts that the community experienced. And then from them you go up to the potential drivers and interaction that occur between them. And this is actually one of the methodology that was proposed by Jakob. I just cited his paper. It's the surname is very complex for me, so I would just say Jakob. But the paper is cited there, and he used it for indeed disentangle the complexity between hazard and impacts. But then, of course, there are also other things, exposure, vulnerability. So we still need to think a bit outside the box on this.
Okay. Yeah, and I think I mean, if we look at the components of an early warning system, trying to identify these risks, that's like one of the first key components that's required. So of course, a part of the system has to be understanding and trying to disentangle these impacts. So you have a few other questions, but I'll move on to Erica. Okay, someone asks, do you disaggregate impacts? I look at different types of people within the community. Maybe you would like to elaborate a bit more on that?
Yes. So in our case, we first have a first level, which is the community warnings, which can give the general idea of the level of emergency in a community. But then we also work with civil protection to identify which are the vulnerable points within the community based on their previous experience. So places where they had to do more actions or where they usually quite problematic in certain situations. So once those points are identified, we can create a specific warning for that site. So this is our type of approach to look at different perspectives or different vulnerabilities or people within the community, because some of the sites can range from a school to an elderly house, to a local park, to a camping site. So it depends on the vulnerability profile of the site and the people that are within it. And then we consider that when we build the warnings and the warning threshold. So this is the approach that we have. Then that we have to identify first the points and then we do it, but it's not necessarily in the warning for the community.
Okay, great. Did anyone else have anything on that? I thought this was actually an interesting question that someone else asked about. Do you consider communities where people aren't as technologically savvy? Because I know you're using an application.
Yeah. So actually yesterday we were talking about that with one of the cities, and the chief of the civil protection was quite vocal on saying that in their case, they have assessed that people feel more calm in their city when they have the warnings or the information on social media and Twitter. So we can use the app for people that are already technological savvy, or specific people, like I said, a principal or the chief of the firemen or something like that. But to widespread it, we need different channels. So in this case, it could be social media, it could be the radio, or we can have people house to house, but that depends on the community. So we talk with them, and then we have to identify what are the communication requirements, because imagine that in the case we have a city that not necessarily, that one of the vulnerable points is an elderly house, then maybe the app can only work for the director of the elderly house, but not necessarily for their family. So we have to come up with another strategy, but that it has to be case to case to understand what are the requirements.
Yeah. Okay. I'll move on to Matthias. There's a question here that says, are the impact database publicly available?
At the moment, these bases are in process of development. They are currently in construction and testing phase. So how to share and consult this information, who has access, if there is confidential information, it needs to be discussed in our project groups. But we plan to have this discussion, but at the moment we are in a preliminary stage. However, we think that this public access or the user access is very important for this tool.
Yeah, I thought when you were presenting as well, I had this thought about, what happened in New York earlier, well, maybe last month. The fact that they issued this warning about extreme rainfall and thus the likelihood of flash flooding, but then they didn't really go into the actual impacts, and people were unaware that, okay, maybe their basements would have been flooded. And so sometimes I wonder, it's, you don't necessarily have to wait on these meteorological agencies to issue these warnings, because if they're not giving you, but if they have some source, some database where they can even check to see what some of these impacts on their own, then that could be quite helpful. I see there's another question here that says, can you reflect on the physical spaces and opportunities for organizations to interact in Argentina? I'm also interested in how much of a barrier this is to interdisciplinary work.
Argentina is a very large country. There's so diversity inside the country, and also there is a lot of very heterogeneous the situation of the risk agencies. So this is possible to work like in certain cases, and the difficulty that we have is to make this tool at the national level and that keeping in permanent in time. So this is one of our principal difficulties.
Okay, I just realized maybe I should share my screen. Okay, good, thanks. Just to be clear, everyone is seeing the mirror board on my screen.
Yeah, we are.
Okay, great. Okay, and then we do have a question. This was in the chat, and I just pulled it over here. I know Gemma answered it, but maybe I'll give you the opportunity just to expand on it a bit more. So, they asked about in the reality, all predictions are uncertain. Assuming a probability distribution can be predicted, how would your approach need to be modified to select the optimum action?
Yeah, thanks. Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, just to elaborate, because
Yeah.
I know
Yeah,
not
of
everyone is seeing.
Yeah. So basically, I can share the paper, but the idea of the whole process is to capture uncertainty. So I showed a very kind of idealistic scenario where the earthquake early warning system can predict the ground shaking with certainty, but in reality, there will be some uncertainty around that. And actually, the framework is kind of composed of a number of different integrals that can handle uncertainty throughout the process. So I can account for uncertainty in how the characteristics of the wave are translated into uncertain estimates about the seismological parameters. And then in turn, there's some uncertainty on the damage that a particular earthquake will cause. And then we also have uncertainty on, say, the casualties that damage would cause. And so all of that uncertainty is actually accounted for, including, let's say, the uncertainty on a false alarm. So how probable a false alarm is accounted for by thinking about how probable no damage is in a situation. So that's how false alarm is kind of equated with no damage. And then basically the method kind of takes the expected value at the very end of the loss, and that's how we handle uncertainty. So there's a lot of like mathematical details behind it, but yeah, I think that's a high level explanation.
Yeah, I know. I know sometimes there's also this question of what action you should take versus what actions people actually do take, and of course it's like using these different approaches to decision making, whether it's like rational or more of a descriptive type approach. So I think it is definitely I personally like frameworks, but of course someone would always say, but what about these biases that people have, and people may also take these different decisions. But okay, so I see there are maybe a few other questions, but maybe we can answer that. The presenters can answer that afterwards. So as I said, I have been trying to sort of summarize some of the points. I don't think I did a very good job because there's a lot of information, and maybe everyone feels that way as well. But we did talk a bit about, trying to understand what these different terms and terminologies mean. I know personally for me, even though I was involved in this process, it was very informative because I myself wasn't very familiar with many of these terms, and throughout the process I started to understand how they could be applied to early warning systems and why it's so important. And then Erica spoke a bit about these people-centered approaches, and I think that was the theme that sort of echoed through everyone's presentation. So I think we can all agree that definitely this is something that's important, regardless of what the hazard is and the impacts. I know Matthias also spoke about this interdisciplinary approach. And of course, he did mention something about, it doesn't matter how much you improve the forecasting system or how well you're able to forecast if you're not really incorporating the perspectives of people. You could probably correct me if I'm not summing that up correctly, Matthias, you could clarify that. And then also he spoke a bit about how to challenge these, how to process the actual information. And of course, Gemma just spoke about these risk-based tools. So anything, Marlene or Faith, before we move on to the other discussion, would you like to add?
I think you did a really great job in summarizing it.
Oh, I don't think I mean, I'm pretty sure I missed some things and I do apologize, but so yeah, so this last part of the presentation, which will just be, we just have about 10 minutes left, I believe, is really just to talk about, you know, what are the underlying problems? As I mentioned before, myself personally, I work in forecasting, but yes, I admit I do a single hazard. And I'm quite interested. So how do we get people thinking about multiple hazards? And I realized that in some circumstances, it's not only because you're exposed to just one hazard. There are other hazards going on, but maybe in your research or in your organization, they're just not doing it. So the question is, why aren't more people focusing on multiple hazards and early warning systems? So the way that I propose us to do this is to really, if you can speak up, feel free to turn your mic on and say something, and then I can make a note on the board. Anyone has any thoughts on that?
I think one of the problems is these hazard silos that exist in the way we are trained as scientists and as practitioners. I think we have people that are trained either as like a flood specialist or an earthquake specialist, but even within our university, just looking at where the flood researchers sit and the earthquake researchers, these are like completely different departments that hardly ever talk. So I think just the fact that researchers are trained within these silos, and I mean, we all aim for interdisciplinary research, but I think it's super hard to break through these silos if we're not trained in a way that's more interdisciplinary.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree on that.
I think I saw Julia raise her hand.
Please, Julia.
Yes, hi, how are you? Nice to meet you all, and thank you for the presentation. I was thinking about the complexity of your question, Adele. So I would say, and I was debating this with Matthias yesterday, as we were speaking about this presentation, about what are the governance skills that we should have in the future among our organizations, in order to manage the conversation, manage the resources, and manage the challenges. So I think it's something else. It's something more beyond technical knowledge, technical capacities, or users' needs or community needs. It's what are the governance skills that we need to have beyond that in order to try to respond at least one of the thousand questions that this challenge have.
No, yeah, absolutely. I agree. Like this idea of skills, that's something that we also discuss a lot at the early warning systems group, in the sense that most of us come from, I don't know, like geography backgrounds, or we come from engineering backgrounds, and we're quite afraid to step into this realm of the social sciences. And I've had people quite frankly tell me, stay away from it because this is not your area of expertise. And I think, fair enough, it's not my area of expertise, but I think being able, the willingness to step out of your boundary is quite important. And then that's where this concept of an interdisciplinary approach really becomes important. So it's the skills that are needed, and I think the attitude and the openness to accept that you don't have all the answers and you really need to work with other people. I think thankfully we're seeing that a lot more now in different projects, different universities, and I think this is also, going into this last column I have here about the role of early career professionals, early career scientists and young professionals. I don't know if it's a blanket statement or a true statement to say that, because we're now up and coming and we're seeing what's being done and we're seeing what the challenges are, we are more willing, I would say, to step outside of our fields. Like, I personally never really thought I would have been here, but somehow I'm here. So it's quite interesting. And I found this interesting. this article, I don't know if you can see it here, that says, you know, Gen Z, so these are people born before the millennia, are saying they're flocking to these climate science because they feel like there's nothing else. This is the main topic right now. So if that is really the case, there are these opportunities to really, you know, start training young scientists or young professionals at this point to be more open about some of these ideas. So, oh, sorry, I felt like I talked a bit there.
If I could, if I might,
Yes, please.
I think it's a really interesting challenge, this, because we need people who are really good at these separate disciplines, but we need them to be open to working with people in other disciplines to make their work most effective. And that's not necessarily by training them to be interdisciplinary scientists. We certainly need some people who can actually work across the boundaries. But I think what everybody needs to be able to do is to partner with people in other disciplines.
Yes, I agree.
I agree, Brian. I think Faith also raised her hand.
Yeah, just building on Brian's point there about kind of partnerships. I think a challenge that we've written about recently is the sort of funding mechanisms to establish long-term partnerships, you know, perhaps in one place or across different organisations, that, you know, you kind of apply for some money with an idea and then you're on the ground running, and maybe you've got 3, maybe 5 years maximum, rather than, I think sometimes it takes decades to actually learn how to speak to other disciplines. So perhaps that's a change we need. And I know there are some examples of funding mechanisms for that, but I think there could be more.
Yeah. Okay, one of the, I had also been making some notes here below where I thought, maybe one of the, so we're talked about some of these challenges that onto technicals outside of just really partnerships and collaborations, but from the point of view of how do you also incorporate these different hazards into your early warning systems. And we've also, in the presentation, there was some discussion about this dynamic risk. So you issue a warning for one hazard and you move people to a situation where they're now exposed to more risk. So I mean, maybe I'll ask that question, because once again, I'm not, this is all new to me in some ways. How do you deal with situations like that, where you have the dynamic risk? And yeah, anyone.
So I went to a talk many years ago about the evacuation of Rotterdam in a major flood. And that was really, I mean, they had been through this process, and a key thing there is that the center of Rotterdam is high and safe, but once you start taking people out of Rotterdam, about 10-20 kilometers away, the roads all reach places that will be flooded much earlier, and you don't want people being stuck in those places when the flood comes. And the warning system had to take account of that, and did. So they modeled when the roads would be shut, and the warnings were all based on getting people out either before or not at all. And I believe some of the warnings in the US, they've taken the same line with hurricane warnings. I think you often hear you need to get out by tonight or you need to stay, and I think that's part of a particular solution to that problem.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so that's a matter of really understanding what the impacts are and just having an overview of exactly what's going to happen in advance. And yeah, doesn't sound easy, but once again, I think the components that we've spoken about. I think Alicia, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just to add on this topic, I think another relevant point is the feedback loop. It's something that we haven't actually really considered in current work, especially in early warning. When we think about multi-hazard, then we think, okay, hazard interaction, they will go to then the impacts, and then warning, and then impacts, and then that's it. But then indeed this feedback loop of the human system through their response and how actually they might affect other hazard, it's actually very important. You just think about cascading hazard one after the other, then the response to one of hazard would affect also their exposure vulnerability of the people to the following one. So this is something that in early warning is you don't see, and this is because we still miss the way of quantifying the dynamic variation of vulnerability and exposure for time. And I think this is something that as a scientist, we should keep more attention on this topic, how actually we could quantify this variation of vulnerability. And there was a very nice question before was put it in, I think in the form about how you can indeed create an early warning system, considering and what is the threshold that you have to take into account when you consider all this complexity of disaster risk. And of course, if you then knowing how the vulnerability and exposure might change, then this might help also to understand, okay, how might change also the threshold, because we cannot think about a fixed threshold actually, which instead is something that we have currently. So then it's something just to think about.
No, definitely, that's an interesting point.
The Texas cold wave is a really interesting example of that. So the prediction of the cold wasn't an issue for people because they have heating, but because the cold resulted in less power and more demand, the power went down, and the loss of power had a much bigger impact.
Yeah,
and it's so it was people's behavior in response to the lowering temperatures, or perhaps even in response to the warning, which produced the failure, which then produced the impact.
Yeah, that's true. That is it. I need to write that down. So, because as you put, and I think that's happening. I mean, this is a completely different time scale, but if you even look at like drought, and heat waves, as it gets hotter, more people are using the air condition. There's more stress on the system, so it's something similar in that respect. But yeah, okay. So I think we're actually out of time. So just to wrap up, I think there's a lot going on. I think it's this new up and coming. Not necessarily up and coming, because I think everyone has mentioned that it has been done, but I think being able to make it more mainstream so that everyone can now incorporate these multiple risks, I think that's something that's new for some people, or maybe I'm just talking from my own experience. We talked about maybe the role of young professional groups and early career scientists and what they can do, and how we can get motivated and be more open to doing some of these things, and incorporating them into our research and in our practice. So yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone for participating. I think it was a really nice presentation. I enjoyed it. I might be biased, but I did in the mirror. There are some. I put one link to additional resources, because we do have a site where we put additional resources on early warning systems on different topics. So feel free to check that out. Also, the mirror board is still open. So if you get up one day and you decide that you have a burning opinion on this topic, just feel free to add it. And of course, I'll be checking in and all of that. But once again, Marlene, I think you're to close off.
Well, thank you, Adele, so much for co-organizing and leading today's session. I think we wouldn't have been able to do this without you. So also a big round of applause for Adele and all the speakers today. So big thank you. We will be back October 28th. More details on the next session will follow online. And on behalf of Brian and Faith and myself, thanks everyone. It's great to see you all here today, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you.